But I'm in the business of getting people to know what's going on. And I was a bit interested in the last couple of weeks. I'm still one of those ancient people who read newspapers. I have got an iPad there, and I thought I'd show that those people who are sceptical of my IT qualifications. But I am still a sucker for the newspapers, and it's pleasing to see that so a lot of other people, they still advertise in them to make a point across the nation. And this is the Australian. And recently they ran what would be a portrait of an Australian Aboriginal male becoming the Prime Minister of Australia. And they then go on to say at the next page that we say it can't happen. And it's an advertisement for the Australian Australian Indigenous Education Foundation. And it makes the point about education being the equaliser. As I've always said, it's the key to equality. You get nothing without education. You're the poorest person in the world if you don't have education. And their point is here, that got me thinking about tonight's subject, was that they needed a Prime Minister, they needed better educated citizenry, and all of us here know that Aboriginals share the worst statistics in Australia of health, education, poverty and all the rest of it. And this foundation is doing a great job to promote Aboriginal kids and give them a fair go and break down that barrier. But I couldn't help but think that aside from the fact that why a foundation like that would have to take out pages in the modern world, pages of advertisements like that must cost a packet to get their message across, especially when they keep a website at the bottom of it. But more importantly, why they thought that they'd have to be the Prime Minister to get their issues heard and dealt with across the nation. Because in my lifetime, Aboriginals have got equal pay, they've got the right to vote, they've got the right to land, and they've had a variety of other things given back to them, such as the capacity to drink alcohol, which they are prohibited from doing. All of those have occurred at the same time and simultaneously with the fact that there's been less than a handful of Aboriginals elected to the parliaments in Australia. So you say to yourself, how did that happen? Well, that happened simply because of political activism. And there is no greater motivated group in Australian history than Aboriginals in motivating public opinion. And recently you will have seen the kerfuffle in Canberra about the tent embassy that's been there now for something like 30 years. You will have observed, for those of you who are scholars of history, all of the great marches that have been held by Aboriginal people, all of the great cause rallies that have been held by Aboriginal people, all of the political activism in the last 50 years that has yielded those things. It hasn't come from within the political process per se of Parliament, it's come from without. So how did that happen? It came by community engagement. It came by a minority group, Aboriginals, getting other people on side with them, and with the power of people push the issues that made politicians sit up and take notice and made them change the laws the way they wanted them to. Now, none of that occurred with the benefit of the communication devices we talk of today. We've just heard about from our friend in Scotland, I think he was. So the second bit of ancient communication device, the newspaper, that I was interested to have a look at, and it's great to see we've got a fellow diver here tonight. Anybody else interested in scuba diving here? Has anybody ever heard of the Coral Sea, protectourcoralsea.org.au? Anybody ever heard of that? Okay, great. How many people know that Minister Burke about 6 months ago declared the marine park in the Coral Sea? Right, a handful of people, that's great. I think you're more informed than those people, because obviously this organisation doesn't think that society knows much about it, and has stooped to advertising in the Rockhampton Morning Bulletin and the Courier Mail. I must say that my impression of the Morning Bulletin is a lot better than I have of the Courier Mail, but leaving that aside as a personal view. what made this group that has so connected well across Australians, and last time I looked on the site, there's thousands of people who've signed up to this, and what you had to do was actually write a few words to Tony Burke, the Federal Minister, and tell him why you were interested and why you cared about that feature, why you wanted him to make a decision to protect that marine environment. And literally thousands of people did that. So why did these people then turn around and advertise in papers? Anybody got any ideas? The answer is, of course, that they realise, like everybody else does, that we haven't quite caught up in the world yet, and that if you're going to go out and enter into political campaigns, you leave no stone unturned. And they wanted to make sure that not only did they reinforce the message that they'd been successful, but they also wanted to pat Burke on the back and the federal government were doing the right thing. So I found both of those things interesting in the modern political context, because in my lifetime, when I went into Parliament, there was no internet. Can you believe that? 22 years ago. No internet, no Google. We didn't have email. We had a fax machine. And in my lifetime, fax machines have, there was no, mobile phones were just coming in. So life was pretty easy. The group before me of politicians, they had typewriters and they had telex machines, which anybody who's ever seen those, most people in this room are too young to have ever seen those, but if you've ever been to a museum in electronics, you'll probably have seen them. There's cumbersome thing about the size of that you needed a PhD in physics to operate. A monumental disaster of a thing for people like me. But prior to that, there were no electorate offices even, and I remember the state member here not even having the telephone on at home. He used to use the neighbour's phone. Now, can you perhaps think for one moment, Margaret Strelo, having to go next door and use the neighbour's phone to communicate with the populace? Of course, we can't even think about that. The reality is that that's made it a lot easier for us to get our message across to politicians. There are lots of methods by which we can now talk to politicians that we couldn't in those days. Previously, you wrote a letter to your Member of Parliament and you waited a millennium to get an answer, because by the time he or she got it, mainly he in those days, got it typed up by the typing bill, the good Lord had almost returned in time to get it back to you. And you were conveniently waiting for 3 months, and everybody waited for 3 months. Then when the fax machine came in, oh, well, that made things a little quicker, because then you had to get back about a day or two. But when you got down to emails, it was instantaneous. You had to get the answer back to someone straight away. So what that's done is just raise the tempo up in politics, raise the expectation up that people will get an instantaneous answer. And while all that's going on, the things that we compete with, including the criminals that we've just heard about, they are increasing the technological barriers to an extent that nobody gets time to think about anything. It's instantaneous that you make a decision. So they expect politicians to do that as well. So what am I saying here? What I'm saying is that we have now got to try and get ahead of what it is that technology is going to do to that thing we call democracy. We know in Australia that we're one of the few countries in the world that have compulsory voting, and I wonder how many people would vote, and I wonder what the outcome would be if we didn't have it. But there's less than a dozen countries in the world that have compulsory voting. So at least every 3 years or 4 years, in some cases, people have to make a view. And they, previous to this, were guided by that view by all the things that were around them. After the Second World War, for example, in the years running after that, 85% of people belonged to trade unions. Most people practiced some form of religion. The churches were full, the union meetings were full, the political parties were full of people, the Scouts, Rotary, Lions, you name it. There were all these institutions that society used to get its message across, where people communicated, where they talked about issues, where they had arguments, where they rested cases and they upturned cases. Those are now no longer there. 13% of Australians now belong to unions, 13%. If you drive around Rockhampton, you'll find for sale signs on churches. I think the mayor might even have one former one in her yard. Those institutions like Rotary and all of those no longer have the number of people queuing up to assist. People more and more have less time, and using that less time, they want communication facilities that are going to make their life easier for them. And they believe that politics needs to do that. And politicians have fallen into this. Kevin Rudd, for example, had over 1 million, I think, friends on his Facebook. But do you know what? He couldn't walk across the hall to get somebody to vote for him to keep him as the Prime Minister. Think about that for a minute. And when he came to get back again, try and get back again, he still couldn't he still had all those friends on Facebook. He still had people looking him up on YouTube. He still was able to tweet to people, but he couldn't get the numbers of people to vote for him in the caucus to make him the Prime Minister. So my point is that you can have all the communication in the world, but it doesn't mean a toss unless it can actually change what you want it to change. And a couple of things that have happened, I've noticed in recent time, Get Up, which is become an institution in Australia for political activism. A bit like the old rallies that the Aboriginals had to get the vote in 1966. People took to the streets en masse. They did so in the Vietnam War to take it on when the Catholic Church was out promoting it, for example. People went outside Catholic churches and protested. People took to the streets and protested. So what does Get Up do now? Get Up provides people with an online opportunity to have their say. But quite frankly, as a politician, recently retired, I don't take any notice of it. Why? Because I think it's far too easy for someone to just go yes and no, and it doesn't tell me much. It doesn't say, well, is somebody not going to vote for me because of it? Does it tell me exactly what their opinion is, why they feel the way they do? No, it doesn't. They're the sort of things that politicians used to find out by going down to the pub, by going down to the store, by going to the Rotary meet, by standing in front of the church. All of those sorts of things were the way you engage with people, but people don't have time to do that anymore. So the technology that I want to see come into the future is the sort of stuff like I've seen in Germany, where you've got the brainstorming capacity of online interactivity, so that the government puts out an idea and it says, what do you think about this idea and why do you think about that idea? And what are you prepared to do about that idea? And will you support the government doing it? And if you won't, what's your alternative view? Now, it's too early in its operation there to tell us that it's going to be the answer to a maiden's prayer. But it does give us some insight into what the technological advances may bring to make a democracy more representative. And I'm not for one moment kidding anybody that people go to the ballot boxes having weighed up all the opportunities, having weighed up all the odds, having intellectualised the argument about whatever the issue is, and then vote accordingly. That is not the way that people work. And a lot of people simply go into a ballot, go and cast a vote for a variety of reasons that are not necessarily intellectual. And in some cases they're downright stupid. The way that they have just gone 1 to 5, that's why it's called a donkey vote, where they lose any capacity or interest to do it. Now, technology, in my view, is not going to change that. I often dream of times where we could invent technology that only allowed people to cast a successful vote, didn't deny them the right to cast a vote, but their successful vote could only be determined by a number of things. A, were they sufficiently informed to vote? Did they have the intelligence to vote? Did they forget about their back pocket when they were voting? Now, I'd love to find someone who could invent such technology. We might end up with better governments in the world, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. I don't think Bill Gates or anybody else about to come up with technology that can prevent people from doing the one thing that people all do and interest themselves in their self-interest more than anything else on this earth. And if we could overcome self-interest, I always said if I owned a racehorse, I'd call it self-interest, because you know self-interest is always trying. And the reality is that people vote accordingly. Now, technology is never going to change that, but what is going to change for future generations is how they want to be taken seriously, is how they're going to use technology. And politicians, obviously Burke is the classic example of taking seriously what serious people had to say. Alan Jones took very seriously what that organisation said, bring the house down, bring the joint down, or whatever the term was, in bringing people forward to say to him We think what you said about the Prime Minister was disgraceful. And what happened as a result of that was all these firms took their advertising away. So it does work. You can move people with technology, but it has to be credible to do it. Just sending somebody an email, getting on a tweet, much less putting a text in the morning bulletin, which I, over a habit of 10 years, never read one of them. Because if somebody doesn't put their name to something, if I can't identify them, I'm not interested in what they've got to say, because I could sit there all day putting down text messages about people that I don't like, things that I don't like. I could be bothered doing it. And there are such beings in this world who've got nothing better to do with their lives than to do just that. But that doesn't make for politics. And I think that, just as our friend before me said, that the future lies with people, that is the only future that we have. And capitalising, just as we need to do in his case, on what people have between their ears, is the only future that we can have. We can actually get people to understand that science on climate change is real, that scientists are not in the business of just making up stories for politicians to garble out, and that people power on saving things like the Coral Sea. People who really are interested don't have to take to the streets anymore. They have to take to some technology that will be believed, that will be seen and believed and credible enough to have them change their minds. On that note, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here tonight. I hope I've given you something to think about. As I say, I do have an iPad for those people who think that I am laughing. And the last thing I'll leave you with is, wouldn't it be great if all the sports people in the world left technology alone? There'd be less opportunity for them to have to say sorry every second day. Technology and sports people doesn't seem to mix. Thank you.